Hi guys, welcome back to Infinite Possibilities, the podcast where we explore the lives of amazing people, their choices, challenges and opportunities. And today I have a very special guest, Stuart.
Thank you very much, good to see you.
Good to see you too, and thank you so much for being here. You're incredibly busy at this time of year.
It's been a long year. I think like a lot of staff and students, the last 23 months have been particularly challenging. But yes, the run up to the summer holidays is always busy and doubly busy when you're dealing with COVID contingencies.
Yeah, not fun. And yeah, so Stuart, what's your sort of a 1-minute introduction about what you do?
Good question. So I'm Stuart Carney. I am the Dean of the UQ Medical School. I've been here at the University of Queensland for just under 5 years, and I essentially have responsibility for the relationships with our clinical partners and the provision of our medical program, which is the largest medical program in Australia, as well as a range of other postgraduate coursework programs, and obviously promoting and supporting the great clinical research that happens across our hospitals and general practices.
Wow, damn, that sounds like a very important job, Stuart. Hats off to you.
I think it's, I think the key word for me is enabling. So I think the senior leadership roles are and must be around sort of supporting others. So I bask in the reflected glory of the great people I work with.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. So we're going to start from the beginning and see kind of what childhood Stuart had. So Stuart, what kind of child were you like growing up? How would they describe you?
So this is very much like sort of being in the psychiatrist chair. He says squirming around and moving about in his chair. So I should be used to this because these are the sort of questions I would ask my patients.
Yeah.
So I grew up in the north of England in a small town called Washington, which is around 270 miles north of London. My dad is a solicitor, a lawyer, and my mother worked in my father's law firm. It was a very sort of happy childhood. Parents sort of very close. I have one younger sister who has now moved back to the UK. She's also a psychiatrist.
Wow, runs in the family.
Runs in the family. and my dad has now sort of moved on from being a solicitor, predominantly being a criminal lawyer, to being a coroner. So he's also in the sort of the medical world as well. So sort of reasonably happy childhood, went to a local school, and then at the age of 13, for reasons I don't fully understand looking back, made the request of my parents, who were sort of comfortable but not particularly wealthy, to go off to a boarding school. And so my parents had grown up sort of in Jarrow, and sort of and also my mother came from County Durham, from the sort of the Durham coalfields. So they'd grown up in sort of working class communities, and I think the greatest gift they believed they could give to their children was education. So when their precocious 12-year-old son sort of suggested that he wanted to go to one of these posh establishment sort of schools, where the annual school fees were the equivalent of a small sort of small family car, they obviously a bit concerned about it financially, but felt that this was something they needed to sort of to explore, to consider. I mean, essentially believing and hoping that they were providing their son, as they did to their daughter, my sister Leanne, the best opportunity they possibly could afford. And I think sort of looking back on that, and it was a significant sort of sacrifice. As I say, we were comfortable, but not particularly wealthy. My father predominantly worked in the legal aid sort of service, so predominantly looking after individuals who couldn't afford sort of legal fees and paid for by the state. And for those 5 years I went to boarding school, my sister went to a private school sort of locally. They didn't contribute to a pension plan. And my father, who's now 74 years old, continues to work, and that is partly because I think he loves it, but partly because he can't afford to retire because of the sacrifices they made to ensure that my sister and I got the best educational opportunities or best chances they thought they could provide.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Wow. What about in terms of personality-wise? Were you a very extroverted, outgoing child? What kind of hobbies and...
So I'm probably on the cusp of introvert and extrovert. I do need. I mean, there are times when I'm sort of a bit more effervescent and sort of enjoy the limelight, sort of comfortable, certainly standing up in front of a lecture, sort of, and doing other sort of university type stuff. But I need a lot of time to recharge my batteries. So I do not get my energy from being around other people. I mean, obviously, yes, I get joy from that, but I do find that after a day of lots of meetings, that I'm very tired and I need to nest. I need to sort of to get into my sort of t-shirt and shorts and sort of and watch TV to recharge the batteries and not really sort of engage with the world.
Yeah, that's cool. And just wondering, were you a popular kid at school?
A good question. I was a quiet kid. I was a sensitive soul, so I think a bit of a nervous sort of child growing up, and I my time sort of changed at school when I made my sort of first closest friend, and that was probably around the age of 8 or 9. So I think that was the sort of the tipping point for my school experience, when I sort of found a soulmate, somebody who had similar interests, and we just hung out, and I think that sort of transformed my life, and realised just how important sort of friendship is, and sort of and what you sort of get out of sort of having sort of close friends, people who've got your back around you.
Any chance you guys are still in touch?
We're still in touch.
So cute.
I went to a different sort of secondary school, different high school. He stayed sort of locally. And he sort of now works for the British Prime Minister. So he's works at number 10 Downing Street. So been very busy for the last few years.
Yeah, that's cool. And when you say that you were quite a sensitive child growing up, like, do you know maybe what brought it about? Is it, I don't know, your like genes from your parents or whatever?
So good question, and sort of the relative sort of value of nature and nurture. I think so yes, I mean, sort of as you sort of get older and sort of and ask more questions, and your parents reveal more things. I mean, I think some of the sort of the personality traits, the sort of the neuroticism that I mean, I'm not on the extreme level, but sort of score sort of more highly than sort of than most of the population. I think that is a common trait within our family. It's certainly something my father sort of recognises in himself, but he's managed to sort of overcome it, and so yes, I can see that sort of some of these personality traits come from Dad. But also, I mean, it was a sort of a very close, protective sort of family, and perhaps my parents sort of shielded my sister and me a bit too much from the sort of the things of the world, and some of those early experiences of sort of conflict, disappointment, sort of we came to sort of later in our lives, because we'd had such a sort of protected early childhood.
Shock to you, right?
Became a bit of a shock. Exactly, the big wide world out there is not as kind and protective and nurturing as we thought.
Yeah, sadly. Yeah, and so when you were in high school, in terms of your careers, what was like sort of floating through your mind, if anything, at that time?
So I think when I went to secondary school to high school, I laboured under the belief initially that I was going to follow my father's footsteps, that I was going to be a lawyer. I'd be particularly inspired by Dad, his sort of commitment to social justice, his commitment for working with the communities where he had grown up, and not sort of necessarily moving into one of the big sort of highly paid sort of law firms in the community. That sort of strong sense of sort of social justice and his rhetorical skills had enthused and inspired me, and I wanted to follow in his footsteps. I think pretty early on at secondary school, I realised that the science subjects were probably where my sort of interests lay, and where my sort of abilities were more sort of aligned. So sort of biology, chemistry, physics, and maths were where I was sort of performing best, and obviously that became sort of self-fulfilling. The more positive feedback I got, the more sort of interested I became in those subjects. And I think it was around sort of the age of sort of 13, 14 that I began to sort of suggest that I wanted to be a doctor. And this was reinforced and reaffirmed by family and friends, who thought sort of having a doctor in the family was a good thing.
Yeah.
So being a bit of a pleaser, that of course sort of reaffirmed that decision. So sort of born out of a love of science, but also sort of this was clearly a profession which my family approved of.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, and how was the sort of how was like well, like here in grade 12 you take the exam and then like you do OP, but I guess it was ATER, right? Over.
So we took A levels and sort of as the ticket to go to university. And
how was your experience?
It was okay. I mean, I sort of by that stage I was hedging my bets. I'd continued in addition to sort of biology, chemistry, sort of maths and physics. Also added in classical Greek, which I had enjoyed as well. And also sort of learnt Russian during that time as well, which was sort of a wonderful experience as well. I think at that stage I was beginning to sort of to branch out and recognise that there was more to life than science. So yep, A levels led to moving to the University of Edinburgh to train as a doctor, which is an undergraduate entry medical program, a 5-year program, and very much enjoyed my time in Edinburgh.
Yeah, and when you were like throughout studying, were you thinking like, oh, this is really something I want to do? Because it's Bachelor of Surgery, was that right?
So, so in the UK, the dominant sort of degree is what Australia typically had 10, 15, 20 years ago, which is the Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery. So that is the sort of the UK equivalent of the MD degree, is the primary medical qualification, but it is taken as an undergraduate in a slightly shorter sort of window. So there's no sort of undergraduate degree, then going to medical school, you go straight to medical school in the UK context, and it's 5 to 6 years. So that was a sort of interesting. I loved Edinburgh. Great city, sort of wonderful part of the world. I mean, sort of Harry Potter is sort of is synonymous with some of the architecture in Edinburgh, and J.K. Rowling sort of writing sort of books from one of the coffee shops near where the medical school was. Had a great time, great circle of friends, but I think that was when I began to consider an alternative sort of pathway. Not that sort of necessarily was turning my back on medicine, but the boarding school I'd gone to was run by Roman Catholic priests or monks, so individuals who had joined a community. And I had been sort of influenced by that community and sort of wondered whether I too had a vocation to become a priest. And I think this played into some of the themes I've sort of already sort of spoken about. One, my father's sort of commitment to social justice, the idea of service, the idea of sort of committing to a life of working with and for others. I think the secondly, being sort of a bit of a sensitive soul, like the idea of being part of a community, of being sort of nurtured in a perhaps a more supportive environment. But also the other sort of idea that had sort of come to me was joining the Jesuits, a different Roman Catholic sort of order to the one I'd gone to the boarding school I'd been to, which was a Benedictine, a monastic boarding school. And I think what had enthused or inspired me about that was I'd encountered some Jesuits who were also doctors. So this idea that you could be both a priest and a doctor. The Jesuits, a Roman Catholic religious order of global reach, long history of sort of social justice, real commitment to education. A number of universities around the world are under Jesuit influence or control, such as Georgetown, for example, in Washington, D.C., would be sort of an example of one of the Jesuit universities. So throughout medical school, began to sort of explore the possibility that perhaps had a vocation. So appeal to the sort of social justice, appeal to the idea of being part of a community. I was attracted to it because they really valued education, but also that I could potentially be a doctor and a priest. So come the end of my internship, after a number of years of knocking on the door of the Jesuits, I was admitted to the Joint British-Irish Novitiate, which at that time was in Birmingham, so was one of a class of around 5 or 6, sort of typically sort of early to mid-20s, some a little bit older, seeking to test whether they had a vocation with the Jesuits. And the Jesuit sort of training isn't really long sort of training. It's 2 years of a novitiate, then you would study philosophy, then you might sort of get some more experience as a doctor if that's what they're wanting you to do, then you would do 4 years of theology, then you'd be ordained to the priesthood, then you would sort of maybe do another 5 or 6 years of training, and then sort of at some stage between 15 and 25 years into this journey, the Jesuits would say, yeah, we think you're a good guy and we're going to allow you to become a full member of our community and admit you to final vows. So that first year was a sort of a strange experience of being sort of in this sort of community, but some great opportunities. Taught science in a primary school in Birmingham. My first experiment, the Jesuits like this idea of going on their idea of work integrated learning is to send you either to a hospital or to a prison, and because I'd spent 6 years in the hospital sector, thought that a prison was the better place. So probably the best job I've ever had was as prison chaplain at Her Majesty's Prison Wandsworth, which is what in the UK speak as a Category B local prison. It's a prison in the heart of London. It is a prison which is set up to look after sort of more than 1,000 men and includes individuals who are there sort of charged with offences all the way up to murder. And it was designed by sort of Jeremy Bentham, central control tower, wings radiating out, so sort of the prison and the prisoners could be seen from the central sort of control tower. And I just found it an incredibly sort of, I suppose, uplifting experience on many respects. I mean, working with individuals who had experienced significant disadvantage. 40% of the prisoners were illiterate and enumerate. But there was a significant generosity of spirit, that sort of a warmth and a generosity and an engagement with the sort of the chaplaincy services. I suppose we were amongst the only people they could see on a regular sort of level, but insights into the journeys people had been on, and I did this as part of a fabulous sort of chaplaincy team. So learned how to sort of give sermons on a Sunday. That was my first experience of preaching in a church, and I remember the chaplain suggesting that I needed to be careful because there had been occasions where priests had preached sermons in prison churches and there'd been riots, so you needed to be careful that you didn't do or say anything that could sort of incite sort of a riot. So it's quite so you've got to be careful about sort of choosing your words. But no, I mean it was a sort of it was a great sort of a great environment, and really sort of benefited from a very strong, nurturing, supportive sort of team, and enjoyed the work. Felt it was important work. I think one particular sort of example, one particular sort of prisoner with whom I sort of worked with and engaged as the chaplain, he had spent 17 of the previous 20 years behind bars, and was sort of been charged with more sort of stealing related offences. And I remember sort of with his partner sort of going to join him at the Crown Court when he was sort of entering a plea, and I think circumstances were such that a determination to be made, an alternative sort of alternative to a custodial sentence was being considered. So I was asked to sort of provide a character witness, which I sort of did. I was wearing my sort of clerical suit, and there was a bit of a kerfuffle as to whether I needed to swear on a Bible if I was dressed like a priest. Anyway, he sort of pleaded guilty and was remanded in custody until such time as he could be sort of sentenced. And at that point he changed from his civilian clothes into his prison clothes, and his clothes were put into a prison bag. So I sort of dressed in my priest outfit, said I would carry his bag to where him and his partner lived, had this prison bag over my shoulder, sort of with Her Majesty's Prison on the side. Yeah. We made our way to one of the train stations near the courthouse, and somebody on the platform opposite shouted out, "Here, that vicar's just been let out of prison." Because there we are, dressed as a priest with this prison bag on my shoulders, and not put off. I mean, some people would have been put off by sort of a priest carrying a prison bag. Yeah. I know she came under the under the railway lines to our platform to engage us in conversation. And it turned out she was not long out of prison. She'd been at Her Majesty's Prison in Holloway, and was very grateful to the chaplaincy team who had kept her in touch with her boyfriend, as was in another of London's prisons at the time.
Yeah, that's so cool. And yeah, and more about the work of being like chaplaincy. So was it maybe like confronting in many ways? And how do you sort of maybe draw boundaries between, like, I guess there should be, like, you should sort of remain professional, but it's so hard not to become emotional at the same time.
So, I mean, I think that's probably a sort of a key area around any sort of professional sort of pathway, be it sort of religious pathway, sort of a faith-based pathway around priesthood, or be it a sort of as a lawyer or as a doctor.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think possibly, I mean, as is often the case with these things, it was in my early 20s and sort of somewhat naive and felt that I could sort of convert the world and change the world. That I, but nevertheless, entered into it with support, with supervision, believing that sort of that the greatest gift we could give was our time.
Yeah.
So and I wasn't going to be going out to talk to people who didn't want to talk to me. It was typically individuals on the list who'd indicated they wanted to see the chaplain. Oh. So it was more around sort of just providing somebody to talk to, and it may be sort of more sort of maybe a more spiritual conversation, but typically it was just somebody to pass the day with, somebody just to have a chat, somebody, a friendly face. Yeah. And I think the point you raise around boundaries is really important, and the way in which I'd look at this within sort of healthcare, within the work in the prison, and the work within academia. I think we have a responsibility, I think, to be friendly in our demeanour, that sort of kind and compassionate and caring. But we need to be careful and clear that I'm not coming here as the friend. I'm not the friend to my patient. I'm not the friend to the parishioners or the prisoners with whom I was working. I'm friendly, but there are boundaries, as you say, that sort of there are sort of limits to the type of support that I can and should sort of provide in that regard. Yeah, and also just kind of curious about the timeline of events. So when was like the seed planted for when maybe I could be a priest and doctor in the 6-year degree? So probably in the first couple of years of my time at medical school, so 18, 19, sort of 20, that sort of window. The idea of a vocation sort of had occurred to me around 16, 17, but then sort of began to give it, I suppose, more serious thought in my sort of when I was sort of 19, 20. And then graduated medical school, 23, completed my internship, 24, joined the Jesuits. At the age of 24. Wow, fascinating. So I'm kind of curious, did any of your maybe peer group have the same idea, and what was the reaction from your parents? So none of my peer group had the same idea. My parents, my father, he had flirted with the idea of joining the priesthood himself. And he is Roman Catholic. My mother is of the Church of England, the Anglican tradition. She was less comfortable with the idea. She was concerned that her son had sort of had succumbed to a cult and found the whole thing quite distressing. My father, somewhat caught in the middle, wanting to console and support my mother, but also be supportive of me. So I think I look back on my time in the Jesuits. I'm glad I did it, and then I'm glad I left. And I think my parents are sort of equally glad that I left as well. Yeah, what was your sister's reaction, by the way? Oh, she, by that stage, had sort of, yes, she had thought that her brother's old anyway, so yes. Although I do recall when I left the Jesuits, and I had a particularly sort of, what she perceived to be sort of untrendy haircut, that she made arrangements for me to go to a fancy sort of hairdresser, sort of as my first visit out, my first visit out of the priesthood was to sort of to make myself a little bit more presentable to her friends and social circle.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so when you say that you're glad you did it, but you're glad you left, so what were you glad about, and maybe like why, like how was it different to what I guess you expected and the reality?
So I think, I think the bottom line is it probably wasn't a good fit for me. I was looking for things within the Jesuit lifestyle, which which they could never provide. That I did find living in community much tougher than I thought it was going to be. I think I struggled with the idea of obedience and sort of leaving decisions about my future in the hands of others. So perhaps I lacked the humility.
Yeah.
Maybe I was a little bit too selfish for living in community. Maybe I was a little impatient, and the idea that this was going to be a slow burn and something that was going to take 20, 25 years didn't sort of appeal either. So I think for a range of reasons, I sort of made the determination that it wasn't right for me there and then, and that I should go back to medicine. And I went off and joined the training program at Oxford to train as a psychiatrist.
Ooh, and why psychiatry out of everything?
So psychiatry was a subject that I'd enjoyed most when I was in medical school, and going back to sort of one of the things that was a subject I did particularly well at as well at medical school. So that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, it became a sort of an external affirmation. But psychiatry, I think, also sort of played into some of those early themes with my father's commitment to social justice.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that had attracted me to the Jesuits in the world of social justice is that the Jesuits preferentially committed to working with the most disenfranchised within society. So the Jesuits have a phrase, a preferential option for the poor, that there are services more broadly within society which sort of look after sort of healthcare, which look after sort of social care, but basically looking for what are the gaps, where are the areas where sort of an organisation such as the Jesuits can add value. So that sort of thinking, that sort of commitment to social justice, coupled with love of psychiatry and interest in sort of the neurosciences and sort of just how people work, attracted me to psychiatry, which I mean, at the time in the UK, wasn't as competitive perhaps as some of the other specialties. So there was a sort of a great need, and I knew that the psychiatrist would perhaps be more receptive, more tolerant of the fact that I'd taken a bit of a career break and joined the Jesuits, and indeed they were.
Yeah, okay, cool. And when you started later working as a psychiatrist, was there any sort of difference between expectation and reality?
So, I mean, I think obviously sort of my career has evolved into a sort of a more academically focused sort of position. So, I mean, my training was predominantly in that sort of clinical environment. I have patient ward-based experience. It is a tough, it can be a tough environment, a lot of emotion being expressed, and sort of and supporting individuals who are really suffering significant sort of psychological distress associated with mental illness. So yeah, that is sort of that is hard. That requires sort of support of friends and family. That requires sort of clear boundaries and finding that authentic voice, so you can be sort of appropriately compassionate. You can be appropriately empathic, but you can sort of maintain the boundaries to make sure that sort of that you don't confuse that relationship. You don't set yourself up in that relationship for something you cannot provide for or deliver on, but what you see within psychiatry is you need to be a bit more patient. That it takes a while for people to sort of to come through acute episodes of illness, but actually if you're patient, they do, and that the majority of the people we work with within psychiatry will sort of will be able to sort of to return to sort of a level of functioning and a sort of a place of sort of happiness that they had previously enjoyed. There are some individuals who, yes, do live with sort of chronic sort of psychological and physical sort of issues, and similarly, we can work with them, and we need to work with them to alleviate their suffering, and sort of. So it's a tough job. It's a tough job. But it's a fulfilling job. I mean, you are sort of bringing to bear your sort of expertise, your sort of scientific training, your interpersonal skills as a member of a team to alleviate the suffering of others. I mean, what better sort of what better thing can you give to your patient, to community, than that?
Yeah, and so how did you find yourself as UQ Medical Dean?
So, so I trained at Oxford, became interested in sort of epidemiological research. On the back of epidemiological research, became interested in sort of workforce planning and sort of how we could develop a workforce to better serve the needs of the populations we serve. Worked in the Department of Health England. That led to a subsequent academic appointment as Vice Dean Education at the University of Exeter. From there, I moved to Dean of Education at King's College London, and 5.5 years ago, headhunters knocked on the door and said, "Have you thought about coming out to Australia? Have you thought about working as Dean of the UQ Medical School here in Australia?" I hadn't thought of it, but the idea of working outside of the UK sort of appealed. It was at an appropriate time in my life. My parents are and were in reasonably good health, so I didn't feel sort of that I would be letting them down if sort of if I were to sort of travel 20,000 miles away. And yes, so the opportunity sort of opportunity arose, and came out here to be interviewed. Cool. It was a beautiful September day for the interview. They offered me the job, and 3 months later, I started here.
That's cool, and we're pretty much out of time, so 2 quick questions. Give it maybe a minute's response. Deep ones. So, Stuart, what's the meaning of life, and what's your perfect day in the life?
What is the meaning of life? I think meaning of life for me, I think ultimately it is hopefully leaving the world in a better place than you found it. And the perfect day for me, obviously some sort of great events in the sort of in the university world. Looking forward to graduations coming up. Had a great sort of launch event on Monday in the Darling Downs in the southwest to launch a new initiative as part of that sort of broader Queensland commitment to support regional training. But if I wasn't selecting a perfect day from the work environment, it probably would be sort of brunch with friends, and possibly sort of kayaking in the afternoon, sort of off one of our sort of one of our beaches, or through an inlet, sort of getting a bit of beautiful exercise, lovely time with friends, great meals. That is my idea of a perfect day.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, good place to end this. Let's say bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.